Hello, everyone from the YouTube channel and from Spotify. Welcome to this podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Fedi Lecamus.
Whoop whoop. That's me. I'm Fedi Lecamus.
Nice, man. Do you want to give yourself a quick introduction for the people who don't know you? Maybe some of them do. And then we can just get started with it.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Fedi Lecamus. I work with Muslim entrepreneurs to help them get closer to God, and to make more money. It's basically a framework I tried to come up with after reading so much Napoleon Hill and Charles F. Hannell and basically the master key system and kind of the mindset and the subconscious mind, but just putting it in like an Islamic frame and obviously with that entrepreneurship aspect with making money online.
Awesome, man. And I'll also make sure to leave your channel in any description for people if they want to check it out. But yeah, man, today's topic, or at least what could be interesting to talk about today, I think could be about consciousness, and more specifically, as we just discussed, because obviously it doesn't have to be like, oh, let's talk about this, because we obviously did discuss it before, about feeling blocked on your journey, and specifically like having the feeling that you're stuck in the same position for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So to get started with that, Fadi, do you want to like maybe share a bit about your experience with this specific
Yeah,
problem?
of course. I think to understand it better, you have to focus on what the symptoms are of being blocked. Because saying you feel blocked is one thing. The symptoms are you not progressing. Symptoms are you having doubt in your journey. The symptoms are you kind of despising the work that you do and feeling like nothing is coming from it. It's that feeling that you have when you don't think anything is working. And most of the time, people don't have it when they're not doing anything, if that makes sense. This is people who are actively putting in the work, but you, for some reason, just feel blocked. And the biggest symptom, as I said, of that is that doubt. And in my experience, whenever I've had that, this would always be when cold calling, right? I used to do like 150 cold calls a day back when I had my agency. And even though I would get meetings from those cold calls, like I generally would get meetings and I'd be excited when I book them. Once I stopped cold calling, I still had that doubt. I could book 5 meetings, I could book 0 meetings, I could book 10 meetings after a cold calling session, but that doubt remained regardless. Even when I was on sales calls. And I remember when I closed my first client, the doubt was still there. And that's when I realized it's not really a progression thing because I had made some level of progress physically. Like when you go from 0 cold calls after doing 1,000, you already are a different person, right? You've
Hmm.
learned a new skill potentially. But that doubt really held me back from finding any success with that first client. I remember the campaigns didn't go very well. I feel like I might have slightly sabotaged it because they wanted to do another campaign, and I said, like, I don't think it would work. And I was very adamant in continuing to work with them. I feel like the doubt was what kind of offset me and made me a lot less successful with that initial client after so many cold calls. And yeah, I mean, when we look at these things, by the way, whenever we try and like understand consciousness, it's such a complicated word, right? Like it's for some
Hmm.
people it means loads of different things. For
Hmm.
me, it's more so you look at the symptoms in which you live in, and if those symptoms are negative, it's usually a consciousness issue. It's you not being aligned with who you want to be, or you're not aligned with where you want to be. And most specifically, it's the fact that you haven't controlled your mind. If that makes sense. Something I like to tell my students is that, uh, you know, as I mentioned from an Islamic perspective, God has control over all things. And the one thing he's given man control over is his own mind, his own thoughts. So if you're not controlling your thoughts and directing them to where you want to be, then you have kind of this loose energy that you're putting everywhere. One time it's negative, but then you're excited about your goal, but then you also have this doubt, but then you're uncertain about it, and then the uncertainty turns into fear. You're scared of the success, and then all of a sudden you have this old belief that money is bad for you that you had from your parents because maybe they weren't super wealthy, and then that ends up holding you back. So that's my experience, to be honest, from your horse. Like I'm curious how you've kind of understood consciousness, really. Like, how would you maybe explain that? It's such a heavy hitting word.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good one. I kind of was in a similar boat as you in the beginning because I always used to focus so much on the actual task. And then at the end of the day, I would have not so much meetings as I would like to, and then I would feel disappointed. Um, and I think that the problem is that I was judging my progress with something which I could not control, if that makes sense. And I'm gonna
Right.
answer
Yeah.
your question in a second about consciousness because it's a little bit of a tangent, but I believe that the reason that people tend to feel stuck where they're at is just because they think they're stuck where they're at. And as a result, they are stuck where they're at. So it's a little bit tricky if you explain it like that. But I believe that consciousness is really about expanding what you're able to conceive about something. And to make that simple is whatever you believe can happen, will happen. So if you believe you are capable of booking meetings for yourself, booking 5 to 10 meetings a day, if you believe you're capable of signing clients, that is going to happen. But if you already don't see yourself as a person who could possibly make money online or as a person who could possibly book meetings, it's just not going to happen. Um, there was this interesting thing which I read in a book lately about reality is just the repeated and habitual things which we already see often. So
Okay.
so it kind of like you can judge if something is real based on how often you see it. So for example,
Right.
if I ask you to imagine being a billionaire, it's going to be tricky. But if I ask you to imagine your fridge, it's going to be easy because you've seen it so many times. So what I think consciousness is just the ability to expand what you think can be true. I don't know. I don't know what do you think about that? Like what would
I
you
think
say your
I'm
definition
so
is?
glad you said the word expansion. That's why I gave you such a creepy smile. Is because the universe itself is in constant expansion. Now, this is going to sound really far-fetched, but just bear with me. The universe itself is in constant expansion. Therefore, the natural order of being is something that starts off small and ends up expanding. Life itself has to expand and evolve. But you see, our thoughts dictate where the expansion lies. So, for example, if you can expand something, there's nothing negative or positive in expansion, right? It's just expansion of something. So if you were to think, right, I'm not going to give it a title or anything like that, but if you were to think you are incapable, the more you think about that, the more you are expanding that thought, and therefore the more you are expanding that reality. Your incapacity will be translated based on a certain extent of expansion. What I mean by that is if you imagine yourself at level one thought, once that thought becomes level three, maybe you have a first action. Once that thought becomes level five, maybe the action becomes a habit. Once the thought becomes a level 10, maybe that thought that you had and that action becomes ingrained in your life and you will never stop doing it. Basically, the more you expand the thought, the more it itself expands into an action, and that action therefore continues the initial expansion from the thought and translates into your reality. Like I hope that makes sense. It's like imagine it starts from a thought. Once the thought expands far enough, it becomes an action. Once the action expands far enough, it becomes a reality. And like you have to understand that the thought is what you control. When people say I'm a victim of life, for example, well, you are a victim just of yourself. Like you're the one who brought this upon yourself. And it's okay for you not to realize it at first. The whole point of consciousness, in my opinion, as well, is understanding that expansion, being aware of that expansion, being aware that your thought is what will create the life that you live. So you might as well control your thought. And you don't control your thought with more thoughts, you control your thought with awareness. And people find it difficult to like judge awareness. But if you were to pause right now, you're listening, like if you were to just pause and try and think of what you're thinking, like trying to focus on what you're thinking, the thought itself will disappear. You've achieved awareness. Like if you were to fully focus on the words I'm saying and ignore what I said previously and ignore the pause that's going to come, then you've become aware. Like you're fully aware of the current moment. And I think that's kind of where people should aim to be. And the reason, if we link it back to the symptoms earlier, Horst, and I'd love to hear how you've managed to kind of um, get rid of a lot of the symptoms of being like unconscious, if you will. You stop being anxious once you realize that there's a degree of control that you have. And once you're taking action towards having that level of control, things tend to fit into place. And no matter what my external success was, like I signed a client. If you told this to me 6 months before I signed this client, I would be jumping over the moon. Like, what the heck? I'm so happy. But because I built up so much momentum, I expanded negative thoughts so much that no matter what my reality was, it ended up being a negative reality, but based on my thoughts. So it all comes not necessarily from perception, but it all comes from that initial thought. That's why you have to be aware of your thoughts so that you can control them and in turn control your reality. Because once that thought expands enough, once you develop it enough, it turns into an action. And that's why you see people suddenly changing their personality. They've just been thinking about it for such a long time, right? Like your friend who's wanting to, let's say, quit smoking, he's been thinking of not smoking for years. That's why all of a sudden he stopped. Same with the other way around. Your friend has thought about trying to smoke. That's why all of a sudden, when you guys became 16, 17, he started smoking. It's not the first time he thought about it. It just expanded far enough until the reality came to life. His action came to life.
I think that's a really good explanation. It kind of starts out as a very, uh, you could say, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't think of it in English. Innocent, a very innocent small thought, and then it ends up by repetition usually. Because what I learned is that the easiest way to achieve consciousness or anything is just repetition. Initially, you're gonna have moments that you are aware of something, but it's going to fade very quickly, especially if you surround yourself with things that are easily going to distract you. So you can actually make it easier for yourself to become more aware if you design your environment in a way it's going to make it easier. So what I mean is not like being on your phone while eating, or I don't know, when you're speaking to someone, giving them your full attention instead of thinking about what is next for you to do, for example. Um, but yeah, man, I think that's a really interesting point about basically thoughts expanding to the sort of point of critical mass, to put a mental model into this conversation. And when it reached that critical point, so simply explained, when the thought becomes so much, and I specifically think it's to do with energy. So when the thought gets enough energy, it transforms into action. And that's when the damage or the positive action is going to be done. So another thing is like, many people don't realize that if they are feeling stuck, it's probably because they're not doing the right actions. However, you have to get to the root cause of why you're not taking the right actions, to like the bottom thing, which if you change that, everything changes. And that's not the action. Because if you just change the action, rationally, you would get different results. But if you want to sustainably, so for a long time, get results, you have to change the thought first. So I think the first thing to realize is also that thoughts drive your actions, but thoughts also drive your inactions. And maybe that's even more important. So would you say, with this thing in mind, do you think that the reason people feel blocked on their journey is because of their lack of consciousness? Do you think that's like the main thing? And if so, how do you think you could get out of such a situation?
I think being incredibly clear on what I keep using the word symptoms, but I should say the effect, right? Being 100% clear on what the effects are. I'm not waking up early. Maybe I'm not doing the hard work that I know I need to do. I'm not going to the gym. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing that. If you want to focus on what you aren't doing, and then maybe you are doing things. I am still smoking. I am still, eating junk food. I am still doing this. And then the habits or the actions that you're not wanting to do, but that you are still doing. If you look at where those come from, they tend to be from a sense of self and belonging within those things. Like if you've been doing a habit for a long time, whether or not you like it, you identify with that habit and you believe yourself to be with that habit. And because you've been doing it for so long, you've lost consciousness of the thoughts that lead you to having that habit. You see, for the first time, let's say, this is a very crude example, right? But let's say the first time you thought of masturbating, you were probably aware that you were seeing something that made you attracted or something that turned you on. And then you were aware of the potentiality of relieving yourself. And then you were aware that you were taking that action. And then you were aware of the consequence. Because you've done it so many times, you become only aware of the consequence, which for me is like the last string of hope for someone. It's like, I'm still aware of the consequence. Once you lose awareness of the consequence, I believe that's when you're in deep, deep doo-doo because you don't even see what else it could be. You don't even like you're not able to string together that this shouldn't be the way that it is, or I'm not happy with this anymore. So look at the end goal. Are you happy with you doing this or not doing this? If you are discontented, you need to break down the thoughts that lead to that action. because people think that the action comes out of nowhere. The action comes from a series of thoughts, a series of triggers, if you will. If you are bored and you just go on Instagram, you've created this pattern in your mind that every time you are bored, you will jump on Instagram. You might think, oh, no, Fedi, I'll just do it automatically. No, 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 you don't do it automatically. You think about doing it. And then without you being conscious of that thought, you do
Mm-hmm.
it. So you have to become conscious of these steps so that you can undo them. Oh, crap. I call myself going on Instagram and I just saw, let's say, an OnlyFans model advertising her OnlyFans. And that's like, I knew that's what was going to lead me. I knew that was going to lead me to something else. Okay, look, I'm looking at it now. I'm aware I'm looking at it. There's nothing else to it. There's no more power to it because you've become aware of those steps and the thoughts. Um, and it's the same. I think it starts, it's really good. The reason I like meditating in the morning isn't just because it's a good thing to do. Like, it's not like an effective morning routine necessarily. It's just because if you allow yourself to be conscious of the things that you've woken up with, which is a lot less than the things you'll sleep with in regards to thoughts, right? Like you're kind of a blank slate when you wake up. You can already start controlling the things that are a consequence of the night before, maybe a consequence of your dreams that you still don't remember. So for me, I'd say, Horst, to answer your question, it would definitely be break down the steps and the thoughts and become conscious of each step. And all of us are conscious of the consequence. I've just, again, like I said, like I've just touched myself. I feel regret. I feel empty. I don't like this feeling. Well, then understand what came before it. Or like what came before that, and then what came before that. Oh, the trigger itself was that I was on Instagram and I saw this. Yeah, that's not the trigger. That's the external trigger. But what was the internal trigger? Because someone else can see that and be like, ugh, I don't want to look at that. But you have a different trigger. You have an internal trigger. You have to look at these internal triggers to get rid of bad habits. And then once you control that internal trigger by becoming conscious of it, all I'm saying is just become aware. Like you don't have to have that strong willpower. Once you're actually aware that you're thinking about this, you tend to stop doing it. Like once I'm aware, let's say once I'm aware that I'm opening up my PC back then and I was going to play a video game, like I was going to play, actually, do you know what? It'd be Call of Duty. Once I was aware I've been playing Call of Duty for an hour, I stop. I'm like, crap, I've been playing for an hour. Time's gone by so quickly and I haven't realized. I stop. But the trigger was the same. I just press play next game. But the trigger's the same. But it's becoming aware of that thought. I need to press play next game. Once I become aware of that thought, I can be like, well, no, I don't. If I just did it automatically by not being aware, this is why people lack awareness. Like you said, Horse, and I'd love to hear more about what you think. Being distracted takes away your consciousness because you're not thinking when you're distracted. You're just going bouncing off stimulus, if you will.
Yeah, that's a very good one, man. Like, I do want to add a very important point here because what
Mm,
I realized in my journey is you kind of go through these stages. First you're not conscious of anything. Then you might come across some people who do some impressive things and they tell you to become more conscious. Then you kind of, and this was my journey at least, I wanted to change my thoughts. I wanted to change myself psychologically, like the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors. However, you have to be aware, it comes back to awareness, that you cannot resist or fight your thoughts. Because if you try to like fight your thoughts or behaviors, it's going to become worse. So instead of, let's say that you, to take the example that you are, touching yourself, and then you become aware that you're doing it, and you become aware that you gave into the trigger, so you didn't have control over yourself. That, to be completely honest, you didn't have control over yourself. You cannot become disappointed about yourself or feel negative emotions. That may be a little bit, um, what's the word here? Like a paradox, because you would think if you want to stop bad behavior, you would have negative feelings about it, because that's kind of what we're taught as children. Like, don't do this, I'm mad. That's kind of the simple explanation. But what I think is much more efficient and effective, and also what I'm doing myself, is not judging that it happened, accepting that it happened because you cannot change it anyway. And then once you've accepted it, then you can start changing yourself from a much higher state of being. Because, and this is probably a topic for another podcast or video, but once you actually get yourself into a higher state of being, you're able to make much better decisions as well. So yeah, that's one additional point which I wanted to make on that. But with regards to the triggers that you mentioned, because I think that's a very interesting point, because literally everything is a trigger. That's what I recently learned. Everything in your environment is a trigger, which means it's either going to get you to closer to your goal if you think about something or act on something, or it's not. For example, if you have on your desk like a chocolate muffin, that's a negative trigger. Not negative because it is negative because it exists, but negative because it takes you away from things which would get you to your goal. On the other hand, if you design your environment with triggers that help you get to your goal, so you put only your working laptop on your desk, you put like a content schedule on your desk, that is going to be much more positive. So, Fedi, how would you say like these triggers that really, in my opinion, are one of the most essential parts to becoming more conscious, how would you go about actually changing those and becoming more aware of when a trigger happens?
So it's the easiest thing you can do is just eliminate a trigger. Like
Hmm.
if you find yourself going on Instagram and that's what leads you to go down a rabbit hole of, that bad habit, then just delete Instagram. Like it's very, very easy to do that. I think you have to look at what initiates the trigger, if that makes sense. Again, and that's mostly internal. Like for me, the every summer in the UK, I am subjected, and this is, it just sounds mean, right? I'm subjected to people who are underdressing, right? Whether it be male or female, they are not dressing enough. They're not wearing enough clothes, right? That trigger is the same for everyone. Like externally, it cannot be changed. But the way I interpret that trigger is what changes the value of that trigger, if that makes sense. So for me, if you had a chocolate muffin in front of you, you defining that trigger as something that tests your willpower will mean it tests your willpower. If you see something that proves your discipline instead of testing it's a proof of your discipline, then it's going to be a proof of your discipline. If you see it as something that's a temptation, then you've given it that temptation. This is the point of, like, I love the fact that you said never give thoughts kind of like never necessarily brand them. It's because if you say to yourself, this action is negative, then what you've done is given that action power to be negative.
Hmm.
This like again, this is something that I think is completely lost nowadays when like kind of let's say people talk about Jesus and everything. The whole point of Jesus' character is to be all loving, which means you don't give the power for something to be hateful. You don't give the power for something to be annoying. You don't give the power for something to be weak, negative, etc. You have to try and aim for that. Oh, the thing I just did. Ah, you don't say it's fine because you've given it power to be okay to repeat. You say, oh, it just is what it is, right? Like
Hmm.
it's a way for me to improve myself. Like this right now is my current vice, but vices exist to improve my character. Oh, okay, now this is just a way for me to, to fight it and improve my character. I always beat my vices. There you go. Now you've given yourself a way to handle that initial trigger. So it's kind of really complex, but the more aware of it you become aware of what you name the trigger and what you give it as a value. And
Hmm.
secondly, you give yourself an identity on how you react to the trigger. Oh, I always give in to eating a chocolate muffin. Well, then you're the issue. Whether or not you put the chocolate muffin on your desk, you still have the identity of someone who gives in to chocolate muffin, right? Like whenever I come back home, I'm usually on carnivore, right? Whenever I come back home, I'm not eating carnivore. I'm aware that that's because I think of myself as someone who isn't carnivore when I'm back home, right? I'm aware of that. I know that. But my mum's food is delicious, by the way. So that's my excuse. I'm allowed to say that. Um, but you always have to look at, okay, how am I branding the trigger? Because for me, that's the most effective way. Can you change, for example, if your parents are like distracting you or annoying you, can you kill your parents and get rid of them? No. Right? That's probably not the morally right thing to do. Can you maybe interpret their actions differently? Can you maybe speak to them and interpret what they're doing differently? Can you maybe change the way that you react to it? Oh, I'm always patient. I always react, with patience when my parents are, shouting at me. What you find is that if you change the way you label the trigger and you change the way that you react to the trigger itself loses all its power. The more you say something is negative, the more it becomes negative. And again, this is the parable of the whole character of Jesus, which is to be all loving, right? That you give nothing power. This is what the Buddhists always preach about as well. It's like If you attach a name to something, that thing becomes what it is named, what is branded. If you gave it no name, it remains a blank slate. So for me, like it just it's so freeing because I'm like nothing is bad or good, and that's okay. If I've given money, I'm going back to what everyone wants to hear about, right? If you're not making the money you want to make, that's because you said money is inaccessible. Whether or not you realize it, you've said in your mind, money is inaccessible to me. I find it hard to access. I find it hard to make because, and then you tell yourself it's taking you too long. But what if money was just money? And the time that you put to get money isn't actually to gain the money, it's to create a new character. And once the new character gets unlocked, he automatically gets the money. That way, money just becomes a byproduct rather than the thing you're chasing. And when money is a byproduct, same like as anything, byproducts are easier to get. Let's be real, right? Like it's a lot easier to pursue a byproduct because you're then pursuing what's around it, which is the actual thing that gets you that thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of based on what you said, which I think is a really good explanation. There's just one principle which comes with pretty much all transformation, and that's reframing meaning. So changing the meaning that things have. Because something I realized, I don't know when it was, like a couple of weeks ago, nothing has meaning except the meaning we give it. It's such profound to realize that everything that happens, like from the computer you have to money to like a tree to relationships with your parents to failure to success, nothing has meaning except the meaning we give it. And to not go too much of a tangent here, the reason that this happens is because our mind loves to put things in boxes because then it saves energy. And obviously, the two roles of the brain, I think, are avoid danger and save energy. So, by our nature, our mind loves to put things in boxes. This is why I really like non-binary thinking so much. So, I highly recommend you look into that if you're listening to this or watching this, because reality is not like a box. There's this conflict between what actually exists and between what we think exists. And more often than not, the answers to the problems you currently have are not going to fit in a box because it's different depending on your situation, to the current circumstances, to everything that exists. So I think also part of this is realizing that labeling thoughts is, first of all, like you can't really label a thought because once again, it's nothing more than a meaning we give it. And second of all, just realizing that nothing is bad or good except what you think of it. And funnily enough, if we kind of change change this meaning that we're talking about here, let's say that instead of, for example, masturbating, our society would label that as good. It will be a completely different world, right? But it could happen because ask yourself, like, whoever said that masturbation was bad? I'm not saying obviously do it, but really think about it. We only label it as bad because the people who probably we look up to, who have achieved certain things, say it's bad. Obviously, there's like the rational, objective consequences which happen if you do something
Of
like that.
course, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, which is why it makes sense. But at the same time, you have to realize that you have to be careful of where you are giving meaning to because, and you maybe have noticed this as well, Fedi, like every time that you give something meaning, especially too much meaning, it always ends up probably not going the way you want it to. So if you give, for example, that sales call with a prospect, like your first sales call, you probably give it so much meaning and it
Very
doesn't end
true.
up being what you thought it was at all.
Yeah.
Because I remember like a couple of weeks ago, I listened back to my first call and I was like, I remember being so nervous about it. And actually closed it, the same person on like the second one. So it was great.
Oh,
But
nice, nice.
yeah, man. But yeah, I think it's just about reframing meaning and not judging yourself when you're doing something like that.
100%. 100%. Yeah. The labels are very, very important in regard to that. And of course, I think you've explained it like incredibly well. Meaning most of the time is given to us externally rather than internally. And I can't remember who said this exactly. Um, but a lot of the time you just have to look at it as everything has some good in it. Like all the things you say are bad, every experience, every stimulus, if you will, everything you see, hear, touch, feel, and everything, all of those things have some good in it. So all you have to do is find that good. Like nature is balanced in
Mm.
every aspect. If you're saying, pardon me, if you're saying something is bad, what you're actually saying is, I can only see the bad thing within this. You're not looking at the opposite side, which is making it good because it has to be in balance. Everything has to be in balance. Um, so yeah, I mean, whatever it is a bad habit, whatever it is that maybe current situation that you're in, if you are deeming it as bad, that's fine. Continue doing that. It's hard to become more conscious, but at least put effort into finding what could be good within that situation, within that habit, because you will find something good. As I said, maybe the habit, the negative habits that you have are actually a test of your character. There's good in that, right? And then you're like, oh, but it's a test. I don't like tests. Like in primary school or in secondary school, like tests are just negative and they're stressful. Yeah, but tests help you become better. Oh, but I don't want to become better. Like, yeah, but your point is to evolve. Yeah, but what if I don't want to evolve? That's okay. Maybe this is giving you the opportunity to discover what you want. Like everything has good something, right? Everything has to have a good thing in it. All you have to do is kind of shift to that, not necessarily optimistic, but for me, a realist isn't someone that looks at the negative and just the real situation. The realist is someone that genuinely looks at both sides and understands that the truth of it all is probably somewhere in the middle. The truth of it all is not binary, like you said. It's probably somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere in the gray area. Whereas a pessimist will be like, no, it's negative, and an optimist will be like, no, it's positive. Dude, it's probably neither. The thing just is, and it's somewhere in the grayness, depending on yourself and what you've experienced. For many people, trauma is the way their body and their mind reacts to a harsh stimulus. Some people who find an event traumatic, others will not. And there's universal trauma, right? I don't want to go on this tangent, but there's universal trauma. But again, there's still some people that go through horrible things, and I'm sure people can kind of come up with their own examples, but they come out fine. And that's only because of the way that they interpreted that stimulus in the first place. The world is way more up to interpretation than we think it is. And that's okay, because that gives you the freedom to live the way that you want. Because you probably won't be able to change the society that you live in, but I'm sure you can interpret the things that happen in your society differently and therefore end up living in a different way. So, Horse, how can we bring this back to success maybe, or for entrepreneurs to kind of understand this in helping them become better entrepreneurs, better business people, or maybe even more conscious people and independent thinkers, like you strive to help people become?
For sure, man. That's a good one. We're definitely gonna wrap it up in a second, but if I could summarize the actionable and practical takeaway for entrepreneurs here is just to become more aware because everything stems from awareness. And I don't want to hurt your ego, but if you think you are aware, you're probably not aware enough. So it's always something which you can work on. That's kind of my point with this. The easiest way to do it is meditation. However, it doesn't mean that you just sit for like 10 to 20 minutes and you watch your thoughts, because meditation is something which you, in my opinion, pretty much have to do all the time, because it can happen that a thought pops up, but if you're not aware, it's going to enter, you could say, your subconscious, and a lot of things might go wrong. That's probably something for another podcast. But the main thing is just for you to become more aware day to day. Don't be afraid to really quickly take a pause from your work, from what you're doing, and ask yourself, like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Becoming present. It's absolutely worth taking time out of your day to do this, even if it means you work a little bit less, because that's going to help you with work more than anything else, in my opinion.
100%. On that final note, the period of my life where I felt the most successful, whether or not I was the most successful is not important, was the time of my life where I did the least amount of work. I think I did 2 hours of work a day. Now that's not going to get you to Alex Hormozy level. I'm not advertising that at all, right? It's not going to make you a billionaire. But it was that period where most of the time, all I did was just read books. I went on runs. I worked once a day, obviously, but I went on runs. I meditated. I read my journal. I journaled itself. I went to work out. I basically lived life how I think the best life could be lived. And that gave me the best life. Work doesn't. Anyways, I don't want to go on a tangent, but formulate what could be potentially your best life. Become aware of that. As Will said, awareness is probably the first step to any level of achievement, success, fulfillment. You have to be aware. You weren't aware of the Matrix before Andrew Tate told you about it, right? You weren't aware that you could make money online before you watched an Iman Gadji video. You weren't aware that it's possible to create your thoughts into reality. You weren't aware of these things. Awareness gave you the power to then make a decision. So awareness is always going to be the first step.
Man, that's so beautiful. There's definitely going to be more episodes where I'm going to bring you on, man. Thank you so much for today, Fedi. And yeah, if people want to check you out, where will they be able to find you?
YouTube. God willing, I'll be focusing a lot more on YouTube. So if you want to see the best of me, go on YouTube. If you want to see me be an idiot, then you can probably find me on Instagram. I'll be just posting random stuff of me eating or anything like that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Horse. Appreciate it, man.
Nice, man. I'll put some links in the description so people can check you out. Yeah, man, I want to thank you a lot for listening, everyone, and looking forward to see you in the next episode.